Good afternoon, everyone. The Inclusion Committee welcomes you here today to discuss a timely and very important topic that is unfortunately plaguing our society. Program materials were emailed this morning and will be posted in the chat. And with that out of the way, we are honored to have, and I'm honored to introduce Christina Yang, who is General Counsel and Pro Bono Director for the Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA. As General Counsel, Christina provides in-house legal support and advice to the management team and senior leadership. She also works across the organization to identify, assess, and reduce legal and business risks. She advises and counsels organizational leadership concerning contracts and MOUs as needed, and in this role, she engages pro bono counsel to support as appropriate. In her duties as pro bono director, Christina focuses on strengthening relationships between Advancing Justice LA and key pro bono stakeholders like private attorneys, law firms, corporations, bar associations, and law schools. She is also responsible for the day-to-day oversight of both legal and non-legal volunteer operations. Christina is the president of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of Los Angeles County, and she's a past co-chair of its Public Appointments and Judicial Endorsements Committee. She is also a member of the Pro Bono Coordinating Committee for the State Bar's California Commission on Access to Justice. She also joins me in serving on the Los Angeles County Bar Association's Access to Justice Committee. Christina was also selected in 2019 for the Dale Minami Public Interest Fellow for her commitment to serving the public interest. And on that note, please allow me to welcome and pass the screen to Christina Yang.
Thank you so much, Kendra, and thank you to Lydia as well. And a shout out to Belinda McCauley for joining us all together and inviting me to speak on behalf of Advancing Justice LA on these really important topics to the group. And thank you to BHBA for putting on this program. I'm just going to share my screen. One moment. This is the slide deck that was also shared via email and is accessible via the chat also. I just wanted to start by sharing a little bit about Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA, who we are for those who aren't familiar already. And then I'll turn from there to speak more specifically about our anti-Asian hate work, anti-Asian discrimination work, and we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to submit those via the Q&A box on your screen. So Advancing Justice LA, we were formerly known as the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, or APALC. As some of you may have heard of us before, we were founded in 1983 by Stuart Kuo, our sole executive director until just last year, actually, when we welcomed our new CEO, Connie Chung Jo, who we're very excited is now leading our organization. We are one of the nation's largest legal services and civil rights organizations that focuses on serving Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, specifically throughout Greater LA and Orange County as well. And we are part of a national affiliation called Asian Americans Advancing Justice. We have 5 affiliates, one in San Francisco, one in Chicago, one in Washington, DC, and one in Atlanta as well. And we are really looking to uplift the issues that face the Asian American community specifically, as there are a growing number of individuals who identify as Asian or who are descended from those who immigrated from Asia. And it's really a very diverse group. The many languages spoken, as you might see on this slide here, also just, growing at a really rapid rate, similar to the Latinx community as well. And I just wanted to touch a bit on our history. As I mentioned, we were founded in 1983, which was shortly after Vincent Chin was brutally murdered. And we were involved in providing out-of-state counsel in that particular high-profile hate crime case that resulted from Mr. Chin's murder. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and how that impacts the way that we in the community look at what's happening more recently following the murders in Atlanta and other incidents over the last year. We are also very involved in impact litigation. As you may be familiar with, now California Secretary of Labor Julie Su was formerly our litigation director for about 15 years, and she brought a case, really a landmark case on behalf of a number of Thai garment workers who were being held captive, enslaved essentially in an El Monte apartment complex. And this was in the early 90s when Julie and Stuart found out about these individuals. And then thereafter, really she was able to pioneer a really novel case theory at the time, not just holding the individuals that were directly enslaving these workers, but also going up the supply chain to the manufacturers and others who were essentially sort of complicit in this broader labor trafficking scheme. And our staff right now, we have about 70, mostly in downtown LA, though we also have about 5 staff in our Orange County office. We also share a policy advocate with our Northern California affiliate, who's located up in Sacramento. And we do use a vast number of both attorney and non-attorney volunteers all throughout the course of the year. And I'll talk a little bit later as well about ways that we're hoping that you all might like to get involved with our work in this moment, as well as more generally. And I'm just going to leave it on this slide, which sort of provides a bird's eye view of the different ways that we're looking at combating hate in this moment. We are, as I think many of you know, following the most recent massacre in Atlanta. Even before that, I think the pandemic and all of the rhetoric coming from then President Trump around the China virus and Kung flu, et cetera, we saw that really had an impact on the number of hate incidents that we saw being reported to us via our online tracker, standagainsthatred.org, which is being run by our entire national affiliation. We really had seen an uptick pretty significantly since really spring of last year, once the pandemic kind of picked up steam through now. And I think, unfortunately, those incidents, even beginning in last spring, we saw, folks may remember, there was a father and 2 young children who were stabbed at a Sam's Club in Texas by someone who later explained that he thought that family had brought COVID to the US. And so, really even before what happened in Atlanta last month with the 6 AAPI women who were murdered, we were already seeing, folks from the community being impacted in some pretty significant ways, and some even losing their lives. Certainly been seeing various really heartbreaking violent attacks on elders in our community. I think a lot of those have been coming out of the Bay Area, and I'm sure more are happening that are not reported as well. And so it's really, I think, just the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately. Many people don't report, maybe they face language barriers, cultural barriers. They might just, be fearful of interacting with the authorities or others. Maybe they're worried about their immigration status or have other concerns. And so we're really looking towards trying to make our resources as a nonprofit organization more accessible to the greater community. And that's really something that, we would love to see you all help us do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But first, let me turn back to the history of discrimination and hateful actions against AAPIs in America. And unfortunately, this is the recent trend that we've seen since the pandemic started and culminating with Atlanta most recently. It's really just one more blip, I think, in a long history of this sort of really discouraging and discriminatory actions. And I think even going back to the late 1800s, some of you may be familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was really the first significant law that restricted immigration into the US. And at that time, The gold rush was ongoing. There was a really large uptick in Chinese immigrants coming to take on that mining and other related labor because of the gold rush. And at the time, many Americans on the West Coast saw, a decline in wages, various economic issues, and began pointing the finger at the Chinese workers who had recently arrived. And so, that's honestly very similar to what we're seeing now in 2020, 2021, with various economic woes and issues being sort of wrongfully attributed to Asians and other recent arrivals, people who are seen as outsiders. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act, it suspended Chinese immigration for about 10 years and prevented those immigrants from China to naturalize. And that's just one example, even so many years ago. And we, and I think many of us are familiar with the incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. That's, not so long ago. That's something that, I think we now think is, really unimaginable, was happening on a really vast scale. And then, of course, Vincent Chin in the 1980s. Again, there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment at the time. There was, trade competition going on with Vincent Chin in particular. He was in Detroit. That was where he was murdered. And he was killed by two out-of-work auto workers who blamed him for, their not having jobs. The perception at the time was that Japanese were coming in and, taking away these, American jobs. Even though Vincent was not Japanese, they obviously weren't making that distinction. And, he was killed when he was celebrating his bachelor party in advance of his upcoming wedding. And so that was really, I think, a turning point for Asian American civil rights, really all across the country, and I think Stuart, our founder at the time, he speaks often about, his relationship with Vincent Chin's mother, Lily Chin, and how that really motivated him to start what was then known as APALC, to really have a place for folks to go when they wanted to try to seek some kind of solution to these issues. And, and here we are almost 40 years later. I think looking at a lot of the same sorts of issues around Asians being viewed as a perpetual foreigner, and, perhaps being blamed for things that have nothing to do with being Asian. And I think, and then just even, I think most recently, the post 9/11 discrimination and harassment that Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities have faced is something that's also, very relevant to what we're seeing now. And so we see all these different moments where that bias is, rearing its head. And so I think, now we turn to what exactly is Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA doing in partnership with our affiliates to really fight this wave of what seems to be really hateful actions. What can we do? And as I mentioned before, what we're really trying to promote is our on-the-ground resources that are free and available to the community. We're one of the few Asian-focused nonprofits that have free hotlines where community members can call in with their questions, seek guidance on if it could be issues relating to a hate incident or a hate crime. It could be a housing problem. It could be, a dispute that they're going through with their neighbor. And we have staff that are answering these calls in various Asian languages and really either providing a further referral within our organization to, let's say, a policy advocate or our litigation unit, for example, to look at the case more deeply, or if there isn't a match between our capacity and that particular subject area, then we'll provide referrals, perhaps to peer nonprofits or government agencies, just try to direct people, because I think what we've seen over the last few decades that we've existed is that it can be really hard for folks who are monolingual or limited English proficient to really know where to turn. It can be really overwhelming and not the most intuitive to know what the best places to get help or even who to trust when you're looking for advice. So we're really hoping to broaden the reach of those hotlines to the anti-Asian hate work specifically. We've also hired for the first time a victims advocate who's a trained social worker to focus on helping survivors of hate incidents and hate crimes in navigating how they can get support. I think what we've seen is that because we haven't historically had a social worker on staff, sometimes, there's only so far we can take those support services without going into that social services realm. And so we really identified a need to provide more of the holistic wraparound services. And so that's why we've headed in the direction of having someone like that on staff full time to really kind of handhold folks who might be looking for further guidance beyond just the more traditional legal services that we provide. And then we are also in this month will be our third month of holding a monthly legal rights clinic, mainly focusing on housing issues, but also trying to use it as a forum to identify repeat bad actors who might be acting with discriminatory intent in our communities, to provide folks with direct consultations. And then if there's something that looks like it warrants further exploring, then to work with our staff outside of the clinic, perhaps even bring in pro bono support. We're working with APABA and CABA on that clinic presently. Thank you very much to them for providing volunteers for us. And our hope is that as word gets out more about the clinic, which is something new for us and is also virtual, that we will have more individuals coming through the clinics and therefore increase our need for pro bono support as well. So hopefully in the near future, I'll be reaching out to the Beverly Hills Bar to provide us some more support in that regard. I also just wanted to talk briefly about our policy work in this space. And in particular, we have been advocating for a particular bill, AB 866, that focuses on providing intervention and support services to survivors of hate violence. And there's three ways that the bill is looking to provide that support. One is really supporting and funding restorative justice programs specifically. And that's really important to us at Advancing Justice LA because, we're certainly very aware of the systemic racism that's inherent in the criminal justice system. And as a result, we would like to see more of a focus on restorative justice being uplifted as a way forward during this time, really focusing on repairing the harm caused to both survivors as well as the communities that they live in, and to reduce any recurrence of these events through that tool. And secondly, the bill focuses on increasing funding for culturally competent and language accessible mental health services for victims, and really just focusing on helping folks who survive these incidents, how to recover from trauma, and really provide them the tools that they need in the mental health space. And then thirdly, really back to the issue I mentioned earlier, which is that many folks who experience these incidents, they may not file a police report. And so that has made it difficult for them to obtain victim compensation from the California Victim Compensation Program if they don't actually go through with filing a report. And so we would like to see that that avenue be opened up more and not just limited to folks who actually do file a police report. There may be various reasons people don't want to file, perhaps language or cultural barriers, as I mentioned earlier, or immigration. Maybe the incident doesn't actually rise to the level of a hate crime, but it's still a hate incident. Maybe they fear retaliation or, some other social consequences. So we don't really want to keep that fund so narrowly defined. And in terms of what else we are doing to get the word out, we just finished one round of Asian ethnic media ads to get the word out in the community about the resources that we offer. We're also about to launch a PSA campaign in English. Really, it's an online public awareness campaign We have a celebrity that I cannot disclose yet who has agreed to do the voiceover for our PSA, so we're very excited about that. It's also going to have an animation component, which we're also very excited about, and just doing some more related media outreach around that. And that will also tie into our bystander intervention trainings, getting the word out to allies as well as AAPIs themselves, to raise awareness around bystander intervention as a tactic in this space. And we're working with Hollaback, which I think many folks may be familiar with already. They have had a longstanding relationship with our DC affiliate, AAJC, as well as our Chicago affiliate. And we are entering into having them do a Train the Trainers program for our staff, where our staff will become equipped to provide these trainings out in the community. We're seeing both, providing these trainings to organizations like bar associations, corporate partners, and also community groups, churches, religious organizations, really kind of running the gamut of getting the Hollaback technique out there, which focuses on something called the 5 Ds: distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct. And personally, having gone through the Hollaback training, I think what's really appealing about it is that the bystander intervention really focuses on, there are various tactics that you can use that are effective without being extremely confrontational. And I think from my perspective, before doing the training, I always thought bystander intervention meant you were going to be, sort of inserting yourself very directly into whatever conflict was occurring. But as the 5 Ds might suggest to you, doing something like distracting the person can really take attention away from the target. One of the techniques that was mentioned in the training I sat in on was, you see someone, undergoing something that's, seems like, harassment or something difficult. Maybe you just go up to the person, if you feel safe, and maybe ask them, oh, do you know where the nearest coffee shop is? Can you tell me what time it is? Kind of redirect them in a different direction so that they're not so directly confronting the person who's being targeted, and perhaps give that person a chance to remove themselves from the situation or get help from somebody else. So there's some really pretty easy ways. I think many of us might already be doing some of these techniques without actually thinking of them as bystander intervention specifically. And so I think that's what's really powerful here, is that there's a specific set of techniques that one can use to really make a meaningful difference to AAPIs who might feel targeted during this time. We're also looking at rolling out a how to respond training component that really focuses on AAPIs themselves who might be feeling targeted themselves, and how you can respond to something racist or problematic in that moment. I think, many of us, presuming there's a decent amount of women on this webinar, other folks of color, or perhaps folks who otherwise don't identify as the majority. I think all of us have probably been in a situation where, someone makes a comment to you, it's obviously racist or problematic, but in that moment, you're not really quite sure how to respond. And afterwards, you're kind of doing that Monday morning quarterbacking, kicking yourself. I should have said something, why didn't I say something? And I think this training we really hope will get people feeling empowered to actually say something, again, presuming you feel comfortable and you feel safe in that moment to actually say something. And so that's something we're hoping to do later this year. And then thirdly, I just wanted to mention on the bystander intervention piece that we are hoping to customize the curriculum for other audiences. And by that, I mean, right now, the trainings are really geared towards, I think, those of us who are on this webinar, sort of highly educated professionals who know their way around a Zoom, know their way around technology, and also know how to sign up for these trainings. But what we're really looking towards is offering these trainings in Asian languages so that we can reach those monolingual and limited English proficient folks, and also looking at youth and senior citizens. With the youth, we've been hearing a lot from educators in the community as schools reopen up more, that AAPI students are feeling nervous about going back to school in person right now. They're not sure that, their peers or their teachers or staff are going to you really stand up for them if they encounter a situation like a race-based bullying, for example. And so we're hoping to get this curriculum out to kids so that they can feel empowered as well to stand up for AAPI students that are in their same schools with them. And then with the senior citizens, of course, pretty obvious there, as we've seen some pretty unfortunate incidents the last several months with seniors being physically attacked in various cities across the country. And so we would really like to reach those populations too. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping we'll get to perhaps around the fall timeframe this year. And I just wanted to talk also briefly about what can allies do to help. And of course, it's the bystander intervention that I just talked about. I think really being vocal about your allyship at Advancing Justice. We have some different social media assets on our website that we would love to have you share. There's a little frame for your Facebook profile. There's various other badges and things like that. I think that's really helpful for folks who identify as AAPI to see that their allies are standing up for them. I think it's a lesson similar to what we learned from the Black Lives Matter resurgence last summer, is that we really need sort of larger society mainstream to recognize and fight against these racism issues if we really want to make it stop or make a meaningful difference. And so I think it's a similar thing here. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, donating to Asian organizations that are working on the ground, helping folks in the community, really huge, culturally appropriate victim services like the mental health and support services that I mentioned earlier. It's really pretty key around language access because Asian Americans do speak 40 plus different languages. And it does take a tremendous amount of resources for us to, keep these hotlines going and hopefully expand them to more languages as well. And so that's something that I wanted to highlight also. And then a related piece for us is we're really looking to advocate for incorporating Asian American and ethnic studies curriculum starting, even earlier than it already is happening, which is generally once you go to college, there might be some option to take those ethnic studies classes. We're really looking at trying to expand that to kids who are younger, starting sometime during K through 12 to really make that a mandatory part. I think just raising awareness at a younger age around what the history is of Asian immigration into the country, what's the history of things like the Chinese Exclusion Act or Vincent Chin's murder. I think it's all really critical to understand what our current events look like and why we're in this moment now, and also why it's not surprising to folks who are Asian or who work at organizations that focus on these issues. To really help us turn the tide against this sort of general American perception as Asians being treated as outsiders who cannot be trusted. I think it really does start at an early age, especially for, I think, kids who are growing up in places where they aren't necessarily interacting with, folks who are Asian on a regular basis or, even other minorities. I think having it built into the curriculum is pretty important. And then just doing a time check here. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about what our view is on how law enforcement fits in. And I do think it's a really complex and nuanced area for us. Where, as I mentioned earlier, with the bill that I mentioned that we are focusing on uplifting, really aware of the impact of the criminal justice system on Black and Brown communities that we work closely with. And so I think, as an organization, we've been really wanting to highlight that we just simply don't believe that, having more police patrolling or enhanced prosecution is the way forward. It's not really going to meaningfully get to the root of the issue. It's really about things like restorative justice, community-based approaches, really getting to the heart of what's causing these conflicts. And I think it's especially true because what we found is that 90 to 95% of these hate incidents, they simply don't rise to the level of a, quote unquote true hate crime. And so law enforcement is either not interested or not necessarily inclined to do much in those cases. And so what we're really hoping to do is to be in conversation with LAPD and other law enforcement to really get them more educated about, who's in our communities, what sorts of services do Asian American community members require, and what are the resources that are available. We're working with APCON and some other organizations on a resource card that we're hoping to have LAPD distribute to officers so that they have something that's literally small enough to carry with them while they're out. And just have, the phone numbers of Advancing Justice LA and other organizations handy so that if they, are trying to help somebody who is reporting to them, then they'll know where to turn, to where to send them. So I think we have been hearing from community members who have tried to report or get help from the police, but then they sort of are turned away or don't feel like they've really gotten any meaningful help. And we think that this is simply just a question of law enforcement not necessarily knowing that organizations like Advancing Justice exist or what specifically we can offer for folks. And then I think we're also back to the language and cultural barriers issue too. So I think we're just cognizant that there are always going to be folks who, in that moment, they are experiencing the incident and they feel that they need to call the police. Maybe they feel physically unsafe, or they just feel like that's just where they think of going first. And so if that's the case, then let's equip the police with the right tools so that they can provide the right response to these folks and get them the help that they need. And so that's kind of our approach to how law enforcement fits in to what we're seeing right now. I just wanted to make sure that I touched upon that. I think it's a sensitive issue. There's kind of a spectrum, I think, across various civil rights nonprofits about how do police really fit in to these questions, especially because I think it is the easiest response when you see more hate motivated incidents or hate crimes happening. Well, obviously, police are going to make people feel safer. I think that's the sort of knee-jerk response. But when I think you really think about it more, it's a lot more complex and nuanced as to what the real impact is for our community and the other communities of color that we would like to support and align ourselves with. So perhaps I haven't been keeping track of the Q&A, but perhaps I can just pause there and see if there's any questions that have come up while I've been rambling on.
There is one question, but before I get to that, because it relates to something you stated a few moments earlier, but you just completed an important segment of comments about other organizations in the API space and their resources and their efforts. And I wanted to highlight some of the work of some of our, sister entities and so forth.
Yes.
So the Multicultural Bar Alliance in Los Angeles was formed also in response to the tragedy involving Vincent Chang. And so I was very pleased that Apollo started a letter, but all the sister bars for the most part had signed on in support of it. LLBA, Langston, Black Women Lawyers, the Pan-Asian Bar. It was wonderful. So definitely a strong showing of support there. And I know at LA County Bar, our VP of Diversity, Phil Lamb, brought to our attention the ability for the Diversity Committee there to be able to attend and listen in to the Police Commission's report on hate crime statistics, and noted some interesting anomalies, and we noted some interesting hidden areas like food vendor trucks and other things which may be misclassified and overlooked as potentially hate crimes depending on the ethnicity of the food truck purveyors. But two last groups that I wanted to mention as well, and I'll put some information in the chat box while you're responding to the questions, so that others might have access to the resources. But I wanted to note that Apollo's current president, Sandy Yu, is working with Karen Wang of the Epstein program at UCLA, putting together an API hate-based crime, the intersectionality of race and gender.
Fantastic.
And that panel is tentatively going to be around May 26th. So that will be available with more details as they come forward on the Apollo website. There are a trio of exciting speakers that they'll be revealing, but it relates very specifically to your point as to research in the field and public policy, as to the underreporting of API hate crime if the victims are female, and there's a tendency to classify it as something else, and particularly if there's a mixed motive, aspect, sort of like the Georgia scenario, where on the one hand, he may have had a drug addiction, he may have had a sex addiction, but at the end of the day, we have an array of victims, and 6 of them are female and API women. So, for a little bit of context, in the last item that I wanted to just touch upon as to community resources that will lead into Belinda's excellent question about academic resources and curricula, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the impressive efforts of Cal UPHABA and their 14,000 attorneys. Carl Jung has spearheaded. There was initially a 3-part panel on the 11th, 18th, and 25th of March, all of which is available for free on demand still on YouTube if you missed it. And recently there was a 4th segment that was added last week, which was superb, and it addressed the issues of people that have a blended API background and something else, and how they've been experiencing the fallout of actions taken against members of the API community, and how sometimes they're not recognized as such. And there's a 5th installment coming up on Thursday, April the 8th at lunchtime. So just thought I would throw that in there because there's so much emphasis on this right now that I hope outlasts the current incidents that are, more recently in the news and remains in dialogue. There is a fabulous question. Belinda's asking, is there a toolkit or other resources available for those of us who would like to encourage school districts to incorporate AAPI studies into the curriculum? And so I'm going to pose that one to you, Christina.
Yes, thank you, Lydia. That is a great question. So I confess that since I am not on the ground with our policy advocacy work in this regard, I don't have my hands on the toolkit right at this moment, but our policy director, Nikki Dominguez, the education piece is a huge passion of hers, and I know she's been doing a roadshow really trying to promote this, and in particular, and I'm not sure if folks on this webinar are aware, but I think it was last year, there was a 5-part documentary series released on PBS called The Asian Americans. And in fact, Stuart and his wife, Pat, were both involved in putting the content for that documentary together. And Pat is someone who is also very passionate about education. And so she actually engaged a team of consultants, including teachers all across the country, to help put together an accompanying curriculum to that documentary. And so there's really something tangible that has already been developed that we're hoping can get some broader traction. I think especially now that there's more attention on the necessity for earlier education on Asian American history. So we're hoping that will be something that we can kind of send out more broadly. And I would love to share that with BHBA folks with some more detail once I can get my hands on that information from Nikki.
Thank you for that. That's helpful to know. I see there are several questions. One participant actually posited a trio of questions. I think that, let's see, how can I put this? It's actually a fascinating question. They were looking at some hate crime statistics, but did not note the source. But they were alleging that there were 1,877 hate crimes in 2019, at 0.006%, and in 2020, 1,773, or 0.0057%. So they were kind of curious if it is, if that was accurately representing the numbers with regards to other racial minorities. I suspect that this might relate to the APABA presentations that we're dealing with underreporting and legislation to change how it's reporting, but you may have a great deal of insight into that. So I'm gonna turn that over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. Yeah, I think you are right on the money with respect to this issue of what the numbers are. I think it's like, honestly, I think it's like anything else where you're trying to collect data from a minority group about an issue that they face. I think we sort of a sort of baseline principle is that we probably aren't really getting the full scope of the entire picture because it is hard to gather that data from a broad enough cross-section of that minority group. And I think also, as I mentioned earlier, with hate crimes or hate incidents in particular, they do tend to not get reported nearly as much as we think they're actually occurring. And, I think a lot of this just, has to do with, there might be concerns about reporting it more formally, like the language and cultural barriers that I mentioned earlier. I think there's also, honestly, there's a sort of reliving the trauma aspect. Once you're away from that incident in that moment, in order to report, you have to, describe what happened, go through, sort of relive what happened. And I think that honestly, I'm sure that contributes to it as well. Not everybody's necessarily going to want to put themselves in that position. And so I think we assume that this is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how many incidents are actually happening. And I think, and I'm just taking a closer look at this guest question. I think, even if these numbers are, let's say that the 2,000-ish is accurate and that's the whole number, I don't think that it really necessarily matters, how big that number is relative to the entire Asian American community population number. I think we can all agree, any number is too big, right? And so I'm not sure that it really matters at the end of the day. Is it 2,000? Is it 10,000? Even if it was one, that would be too many, right? Because no one should be going through these incidents or having to face this sort of discrimination. So I think that the fact that any of them exist is really the problem versus it being a particular number or us wanting it to be a certain threshold, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Christina. That is a very thorough response. The person that asked that question added a wrinkle to that as to, is it something that is this narrative, is it a newer phenomena or is it just receiving, more coverage in the media than historically?
Yeah, I think, honestly, it's something that has been going on for quite some time, as I was mentioning earlier, but I think because what happened in Atlanta was, really horrific, and, obviously very specifically targeting these, Asian-owned small businesses. And really, I think there's been more mainstream media interest in these incidents recently, whereas I think, I hope, I'm not quite sure, but I don't think that, there have been quite so many extremely violent incidents prior to what's been getting covered in the last few months. But I think that, these sorts of issues have always been around, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm going to sort of blend questions from two other participants just a little bit. There was one question asked, have relations improved between Korean Americans and African Americans since Rodney King? And interestingly, a different participant asked a somewhat related question as to what can the African American community do to be more visible in their support for the API community?
Yeah, and I think I certainly don't want to hold myself out as a spokesperson on these really broad topics. But I do think, the moment that we're in now in 2021 is certainly, different from the early 90s. And, I was, when Rodney King occurred, I actually, very clearly remember, being at that time towards the end of elementary school, and definitely remember what happened, but obviously at that time also didn't have a real awareness of what it meant to work in a multicultural coalition, which I do think is a much more intentional part of the work that's happening in nonprofits and community-based organizations. Is there's a real, I think, intentionality on the part of the leaders of these organizations and these groups to want to be aware of how our stances on issues or advocacy for policy, legislation, how it's all it impacts more than just what I think of as the constituency that we represent, quote unquote, which in our case is folks who identify as Asian, right? But it really goes more broadly than that, I think. And I think that's where we've been trying to really be thoughtful, for example, in our stance on how law enforcement fits into this moment and how we want to respond to that question if we're asked. So it's sort of a long-winded way of saying that I feel like we're on the right path forward, but I do also feel like there's always room to improve in this regard. And I think that goes for all of us who are working in this space, and I think have the same general end goal of really decreasing the amount of racism and discrimination that we see in American society, and moving towards one day perhaps we can all say there are no hate crimes, right?
That makes sense. Yeah, hopefully that would be a substantially smaller number, keeping an eye on the time. I see just a pair of questions outstanding, actually a trio, but I'm going to relate two of them together. There was a question that was posed about whether there has been any research demonstrating a specific uptick based on potential misattributions of the COVID virus to Chinese origins, and whether or not we would expect to see an uptick in hate crimes against Brazilians, British, and other attributed, whether rightly or wrongly, not a doctor, as to other COVID variations. And just curious if you might have any thoughts on that. I know it's a very new issue, and I know research takes a long time to get vetted and funded, and there may not be something, but if you're aware, if you would share a little, great.
Yeah, I think on that point, I don't really have a good grasp on like what percentage of what incidents we're seeing get reported to us via either the Stand Against Hatred tracker or the Stop AAPI hate tracker, which I think many are familiar with. I'm not really sure about the relative percentages. Just anecdotally, though, I do know that a fairly decent chunk of those are ones where we see people, who are getting the Kung Flu comments or the COVID-related comments in some form or another. So I do think it's an undercurrent, I think, in the recent trends that we've been seeing in the community. And I think as to the other question about, given that we're seeing new variants emerge that are not, directly tied back to, Wuhan or China or Asia in general, do we expect to see a similar increase in these sorts of incidents against other communities? And I mean, who knows, I think, is one way to answer. But I think another way to think about it is, like, honestly, probably not really against British people who generally look white and are probably not going to have these issues, right? If it's a Brazilian thing, like, if they've got a darker complexion and look more like a person of color, then maybe, I mean, I think historically we see that the sort of finger pointing and the otherization of minority communities is definitely very tied to, whether they are perceived as looking different or looking like a foreigner or looking like another. So I think my gut says British people probably going to be okay. Brazilians, I don't know, depends on how they might look physically. So that's my totally, not researched answer, but just my gut reaction based on what we've seen play out with regard to the whole China virus thing.
Well, Christina, there are some great questions that are coming up. You are really getting people to reflect here. I'm going to sort of put the last three somewhat together, only because they have some connections, and I'm being mindful of the time. But we've had some great questions about how can folks stay up to date on trainings on this important subject matter for various settings, and advice on building allyship across spectrums in society. Interestingly, as a side note, one comment was asking whether or not perhaps Asians Advancing Justice or other organizations in this important space are working with groups that are dealing with anti-religious, hate crimes and bias, such as maybe the ADL or the Museum of Tolerance in LA. Don't know if you might have some thoughts to share on either the resource and allyship or the allyship across both the race-based and religious-based aspects.
Yeah, I'm just chatted a link to our Anti-Asian Discrimination page on our Advancing Justice LA website that kind of goes into some more detail about what I touched on in my comments earlier. There's some links to bystander intervention training, and I also wanted to share this link to our Asian American K through 12 curriculum. Thank you, Karen, for chatting that to me separately and reminding me where it is on our website. So just wanted to share that with the folks who are interested in the education piece that Belinda asked about earlier. I'm actually just seeing this chat from Abigail Zelensky with PABA. PABA is hosting a conversation with LAPD and the LA Civil Rights Department on April 15th at 5:30. There's going to be a Know Your Rights panel. There'll be some time for Q&A from the public as well, if folks are interested in talking more specifically about the law enforcement piece of this and the community. PABA is going to be sending out some more information on that tomorrow. Belinda, can you remind me of the other question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so aside from trainings and upcoming events and allyship, and thank you so much for bringing up Halabak, because I first heard about it on the diversity committee of LACBA. I believe it was Judge Sam Lucas that brought it up. So I'm hearing about it from multiple sources that it's got some really good content. The last piece was about are there aspects, is the API community affected by or working in conjunction with those who are battling not only the race-based but also faith-based discrimination? Yeah, I guess is the way to.
Yes, I do know we're in conversation with ADL specifically, and I do think there's, unfortunately, there's a lot of synergies with, past history. I think, as I was mentioning with Japanese internment, as well as post 9/11 sentiments with regard to the Muslim and South Asian communities, and of course, folks in the Jewish community have faced similar issues. And so I think there's a lot of, wanting to learn from one another in this space, and, trying to be, not wanting to reinvent the wheel. I think where folks have found strategies that are effective in either building allyship outside of their specific community or just working across, different faiths, different cultures, really to have meaningful coalitions around these issues. So I think that's really the way forward, is to really build relationships with folks who are, identify as other minorities, and also folks who identify as part of the mainstream. I think time and time again, throughout history, we have needed folks to be in that ally position because they have access to, different conference tables, if you will, different realms where they can get our message out there. And I think that's what's really valuable to us. And that's what I hope folks who are here today, who might not be as familiar with AAPI issues specifically can take away is just, if you can help, stand up for our community and get our message out there, and then, also engage in some more, meaningful, tangible ways like the bystander intervention. That's all really, really helpful to us right now. And hopefully we can continue to dialogue.
Thank you, Christina. You have been fabulous. I see, I don't know if we have time for one last question, but It is kind of a thought-provoking one. And the question is there anything that we can collectively do to increase strong position statements from corporate America?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, and I think what's been really great is I've been hearing from, I think specifically in my role as pro bono director, having relationships with different law firms who are headquartered in different places around the country. There's a definite interest, I think, now in corporate leaders wanting to make sure that they are getting the message out both internally to their AAPI employees and staff and make them feel supported, and also to send the message, to other employees, that this is an issue that the company cares about and is willing to invest in, put out some resources, put out opportunities for folks to get involved to help and, be allies. And I think, honestly, I feel like it's if that isn't already happening at the leadership level in your company or organization, I think it's honestly really helpful to have folks come together and perhaps to approach leadership in a group and to see if see that demonstration of a collective interest in seeing a statement come out in this regard. And I do think there is kind of a domino effect. I feel like that's what we saw last summer around Black Lives Matter. Like once those really big, billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar companies started coming out, you started seeing it everywhere, like quite literally. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. And I think, that's something that we're definitely seeing more of now, and we're trying to keep track of is which corporate partners are willing to, kind of make that statement, which honestly, I don't think is very controversial. Like we're against hate. We don't want our people to get discriminated against. Pretty basic stuff, right? But it does take some thought to put that together in a way that is helpful to the community. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It looks like we are coming up on the end of the hour. I know how busy the last, 45 days especially have been for AAHA, LA. And I'm just so glad you were able to squeeze us in.
Yeah,
thank you for sharing your insights, all these resources, and, many thanks to Kendra and Belinda. Our ops team, Genna and Alex, were helping to assist with those components. Elise at Asians Advancing Justice for assistance with the slides, and our awesome attendees who posed great questions and shared a lot of wonderful resources. So really appreciate that. And my last thought will be, I see Gina King is in our chat box. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Inclusion Committee that Kendra and I co-chair are always looking for new members, and our diverse business affiliates / outreach to the business community that Gina and her colleague co-chair also have exciting events and are always up for new members. So many thanks, everyone. Have a safe and wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you.